Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Secretary McMinn, members of the council, and guests, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. I have a few brief announcements to make. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to say with real sincerity, the council appreciates our good friend, the Union Trust Bank, for so graciously sponsoring this evening's reception in honor of Secretary McMinn. Also, please allow me to remind you of our next program a week from this evening, July the 9th, during which Deputy Secretary of Commerce Clarence Brown will speak on American competitiveness. This program will help celebrate World Trade Week in Maryland and will include the premiere showing of a short film, A World of Opportunity for Maryland Exporters, during which Governor Harry Hughes will give us a brief summary of Maryland's international economic policy. There'll be a slight departure this evening from our normal activity, which won't affect you one way or the other. All the question and answer period will be off the record. Take that any way you want. This port community is keenly interested in the issues surrounding protectionism. Our attention is especially captured by the fact that tonight's presentation has been labeled a major policy address. We are honored to have with us this evening to discuss the dangers of protectionism and the current legislative climate. The Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, the Honorable Douglas W. McMinn. Mr. McMinn received his BA degree from Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, a Master of Liberal Arts degree from Johns Hopkins University, and his MA in International Affairs, specializing in international economics from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Mr. McMinn has worked in government since 1975. He has served as an economist responsible for East-West economic policy in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs in the Department of the Treasury. As Special Assistant to the Deputy Special Trade Representative in the Office of the President's Special Trade Representative with responsibilities covering all aspects of the United States trade policy, but centered on the Tokyo round of multilateral trade negotiations. In 1979, Mr. McMinn became Deputy Chief of Mission of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, Geneva, Switzerland, and served as Deputy United States Representative to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, sometimes known as GATT. In 1981-82, he served at the Department of Commerce, where his responsibilities covered the breadth of matters affecting U.S. international trade and commercial policies. Prior to his present position, he served as the principal advisor to the President's National Security Affairs Advisor for Trade Policy and North-South Economic Relations. He was designated by President Reagan to assist in policy preparations for the 1984 London Economic Summit and was redesignated to perform the same functions in preparing for the 1985 Bonn Economic Summit. It is my great pleasure to welcome to Baltimore and to introduce to you the Department of State's Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs, Mr. Douglas W. McMinn.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this evening. You know, I have many fond memories of Baltimore. I spent 3 years in the military down here in Dundalk. I actually found on my own old Oberkes. And I did attend Johns Hopkins University. I really have followed very closely two things from Washington over the years with respect to Baltimore. One is the remarkable economic progress the city has made, and I mean that. And the second's been the Baltimore Orioles. Sometimes remarkable, sometimes not so good. But in any event, it's good to be back. The question that I want to put before you tonight is a simple one. Where will America lead? Will America lead to more open trade among nations? Will America lead to greater economic and political freedom around the world? When put to the test, what course will we steer for ourselves and the world? As we approach the 4th of July, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the fundamental principles on which our nation is built. The Founding Fathers understood that political and economic freedom were inseparable, and believed that human freedom and private initiative would bring America progress and prosperity. We've grown from a weak colony to be a prosperous nation. We've done that by remaining true to the vision of the Founding Fathers. 210 years have passed since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, at least if my math is correct. In their wildest dreams, the Founding Fathers could never have imagined how successful America's experiment with freedom would be. Our political and economic freedom serves as an inspiring example to the rest of the world. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Europe are embracing democracy. In a quieter but equally important way, nations all over the world are rejecting state-controlled, interventionist economic systems and adopting market-oriented economic policies. Now, one of the fundamental principles of economic freedom is free and open trade. History has taught us that the freer the flow of trade, the greater the world economic progress, and the greater incentive for peaceful relations among nations. At the moment, in Washington, one of the top issues is trade policy. Recently, the House of Representatives passed an omnibus trade bill. The Senate is now taking up trade legislation. It's within the context of economic and political freedom that we need to examine today's trade policy debate. When the trade bills are debated on Capitol Hill, the vision of the upcoming November elections is certainly clear and present. The voices of special interests are persistent and persuasive and pervasive. The national interest is less clearly heard. H.R. 4800, the House Trade Bill, which passed overwhelmingly on May 22nd, is a blueprint for closing markets. Frankly, it's a bill based you can debate that, greater or lesser degree, on election year politics. It would halt and reverse the record of progress in international trade built up over the past 40 years. It is sure to increase both political and economic tensions around the world. H.R. 4800 offers trade restriction as the solution without understanding the true nature of the trade problem. Now, I won't stand here in front of you and tell you there isn't a problem. There is a problem. During the past 2 years, the deficit on our trade account has been at a record level virtually every month. Then that pattern may not yet be broken. These massive trade deficits and even larger federal budget deficits are serious and mustn't be ignored. Among other factors, these deficits have eroded the important coalition we've had in this country for freer, more open trade. Whatever our preferences, political, economic, deficits of this magnitude are certainly not sustainable. So we must take action to deal with our deficits and the concerns they generate. We must rebuild that coalition of farmers, consumers, businessmen, politicians, academics, and yes, even Washington bureaucrats that has shaped our open trading policies. At the same time, we have to guard against taking false solutions that will only make matters worse. Now, the American economy has performed well over the past 4 years. Certain industries and certain areas of the country, are no different than any other area, have problems. And there are areas that are in difficulty. But I would submit to you that their problems are set in a powerful pattern of progress. Overall, we're better off than we were 6 years ago. prospects are that we'll be even better off next year. Deregulation, market freedom, private sector incentives, and a less intrusive government. These are the things that have produced this progress. We have rising incomes, new jobs, low inflation, productive investment, affordable housing, lower taxes, dynamic capital markets, and an efficient farm sector. The question I pose for myself and I pose for you, why, I wonder, are some now tempted to take trade policy in the opposite direction? Why intervene in international markets when our domestic successes spring from less intervention, not more? Why close markets when our post-war heritage of opening them has stimulated the greatest expansion of economic well-being in the history of the world? Why add friction and increase the risk of conflict between nations? Is market closing the best way to deal with our trade problem? Are the proponents of H.R. 4800 correct? More to the point, would it even work? Let's look at 5 issues that are most often raised in today's trade debate in Washington. Why do we have a trade deficit? How can trade policy reduce the deficit? Do imports cost jobs? What is fair trade? And do we have a trade policy? I got a little bit of a reaction there, didn't I? First, why do we have a trade deficit? Well, the fundamental cause is that during the last 3 years, domestic investment has substantially exceeded domestic saving. Now, the difference, that portion of our total investment financed by foreign savings, is equal to the deficit in our trade in goods and services. Only when we bring domestic investment and domestic savings back into balance will we bring our trade account back into balance. To understand how that present situation arose, we have to look again at the record of economic performance over the past few years. The U.S. economy has created 10 million jobs, new jobs, since 1981. Investment was necessary to create those jobs. In the recovery of the 1980s, investment contributed more to growth than in any previous post-war recovery. Real business investment as a share of real GNP reached a post-war high. The American people collectively, with renewed confidence in their economic future, invested their savings at home rather than lending them abroad, and also fueled economic growth through their spending. For its part, the federal government embarked on a monumental effort to rebuild our nation's security, a public investment in our future. However, while private savings have exceeded total private investment, the federal government has been spending much more than its income. Doesn't come as news to you, does it? This draws off savings from the private sector. It's a drain. Now, how is it possible for an economy as a whole to spend more than it earns? It's pretty simple, actually. Others somewhere in the world spend less than they earn and invest the difference in America. We are able to support our ambitious investment, both public and private, with an inflow of savings from abroad. That inflow of savings must be accompanied by a parallel influx of goods. To reduce the trade deficit, we must restore a better balance between the demand for capital, our public and private investment, and the domestic supply of capital, the savings generated by households, businesses, and government. We can invest less or save more. The choice is really ours. Now, what role can trade policy play in all this? You hear all of this out of Washington, this debate on trade policy. What can trade policy do in terms of the trade deficit? Trade policy does not significantly affect the trade balance. Let me repeat that. Trade policy does not significantly affect the trade balance. To be sure, some policy actions may cause minor shifts in previous savings and investment patterns. But trade restrictions do not affect the fundamental cause of the trade deficit. the inability of domestic savings to finance domestic investment. Trade restrictions can only divert resources to protected sectors of the economy and away from dynamic sectors that are typically left unprotected. When we restrict imports, we act not so much against foreign producers as against our own domestic consumers, our industries that rely on imported materials, and our farmers and industries who actually need those foreign markets to survive. Well, what about jobs? Don't imports cost Americans their jobs? Don't exports create jobs? These are tough questions. Not because the answers are so complex, but because wrong answers are so prevalent, appealing, and often politically convenient. There's no doubt that fewer Americans are engaged in producing VCRs, color televisions, cameras, even automobiles and steels, which I think this community has a great deal of experience with. There's also no doubt that Americans are engaged in producing aircraft, computers, advanced electronics, and agricultural products because we export them. But it's a fundamental truth that policy, trade policy, affects only the composition of employment, not its total level. You can dismiss any analysis that states that a particular trade restriction will save jobs in the overall sense. What it does is to shift employment from our most dynamic industries to our less productive sectors. But what about fairness? What about the level playing field our exporters have a right to expect? Americans value fairness. It's one of our finest national attributes. If we're not being treated fairly, we'll react, whether we're in a trade deficit or a trade surplus. And without doubt, there are unfair trade practices around the world. Although we don't necessarily agree, even some of our own practices, lo and behold, are perceived as unfair by others. Developing countries complain that we've cut our sugar quotas. Our textile imports are subject to tight controls. The new farm bill passed earlier this year expands subsidies for agricultural exports. We recently restricted imports of wood products. We restrict steel imports from 17 countries and Europe. The list can go on. I think what's fair to say is that purity and virtue are hard to find in the world of trade. Now, there's another aspect of fairness that deserves attention. Too often, the unspoken definition of fairness is our industry must always win. Loss of market share abroad translates into an unfair trade practice by our competitor. The trade deficit is seen as ironclad proof that American business is facing unfair competition. You hear a lot of that in Washington. Fairness does not mean that every U.S. industry always prospers. Fairness means we all play by the same rules. Americans don't want guaranteed success, but they do insist on an opportunity to succeed, an opportunity to compete. Where unfairness exists, how should we deal with it? Retaliation? Restricting access to the U.S. market? That comes quickly to mind. There are two problems with retaliation. First, it hurts our own economy. And second, it invites an escalating and dangerous spiral of counter-restrictions by our trading partners. Nevertheless, despite the risks, retaliation may be necessary in some cases. When it is, we'll act, and we have acted. But what we shouldn't do is base our policy on the concept of retaliation. The most effective approach to foreign unfair trade practices is to confront them directly, to demonstrate the unfairness, and secure change, primarily through negotiation. This course serves our broader economic interests and those of the world trading community. It creates new possibilities for growth and enhanced competition. Unlike retaliation, it is true to the principles of economic freedom that has served us so well. Success has not been and will not be instantaneous. It's a frustrating business, negotiating away these unfair trade practices. The political forces of protectionism are at least as strong abroad in foreign countries as they are here. But we've made progress, some real progress. American exporters deserve the full effort of their government to assure them an open and efficient market that they can compete in. But what we don't want to do is bind ourselves as a premise for our policy to trade restriction. As in the domestic economy, our efforts must be devoted to greater freedom and not greater government. Well then, what is the government's trade policy? How do we deal with this? In the tradition of every American president since FDR, President Reagan stands for free trade and open markets. Sounds simple. Is that a policy? I would submit that's a policy. That's our policy framework. Our objectives are clear. Open foreign markets, get rid of trade barriers, and eliminate unfair trade practices. The U.S. has taken the lead in pushing for a new round of multilateral negotiations. We hope to have those launched this fall. Our objective is to strengthen those rules that exist now in the international trading system and extend them to areas such as agriculture, services, intellectual property, and investment, which have, until now, escaped meaningful discipline internationally. Multilateral negotiations are our best hope for establishing a broader, level playing field, free of the holes that we have all dug for ourselves in the past. Responding to a recent Canadian initiative, we've just embarked on what I consider to be a historic initiative with our neighbor across the border, our largest trading partner. We're engaging in comprehensive talks to establish free trade between our two countries. The objective of these talks is to reduce or eliminate barriers to a broad array of trade and investment areas. It'll be an engine for growth if we're successful, both for Canada and the United States. In a series of talks with the Japanese, we've agreed on the removal of barriers to sales in Japan. Sales of telecommunications gear, of wood and paper products, pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, and of electronic components. We're engaged in a new round of discussions which will include automobile parts. We're pressing the European community in terms of the agricultural sector to ensure that we receive adequate and fair compensation for damage that our agricultural exports will incur as a result of an expansion of the European community to include Spain and Portugal. We're negotiating with Korea. We want our insurance companies to be able to sell in Korea. And we want to obtain better patent and copyright protection there. We're pressing Brazil to administer fairly its laws regarding computers and related equipment. I could go on, but I see eyes glazing over. It's only a partial list, but it illustrates that positive market-opening actions have been taken and are underway currently to eliminate unfair trade practices. We're actively pressing to expand market access for competitive U.S. exports of both goods and services. We're also trying to press on the domestic side, trying to get at the fundamental causes of that trade deficit. Congress has tackled its responsibility to discipline spending by the federal government. Graham Redmond Hollings. By 1990, the federal government's voracious, I repeat, voracious appetite for American savings will be cured. The Senate has passed a tax reform package that we hope will enhance the incentives to work, to save, and invest in productive activities. These two measures alone will significantly enhance the competitive position of the United States and release resources to the private sector. It will also contribute to a better balance in our external accounts, a lower trade deficit, by reducing the internal imbalance between saving and investment. They represent major achievements in the making. Abroad, we're working with our trading partners on monetary matters. Exchange rates have shifted over the last 18 months remarkably. They better reflect the underlying fundamental economic conditions now. Agreements that were reached last September at the Plaza Hotel and in May at the Tokyo Summit will promote greater stability in exchange rates. That's also good news. The trade policy debate in Washington is serious, and to me very disturbing. The trend in Congress, at least in the House of Representatives, runs counter to the policy direction that has revived the American economy in the 1980s, and to the course of American trade policy over 9 administrations, both Democratic and Republican. It contradicts the principles of economic and political freedom that have been the basis of the strength and prosperity of this country. The United States has been in the forefront of the battle for economic freedom, just as we've been in the front lines in the struggle for political freedom. The question is, will the United States maintain its leadership role in the global economy and continue to lead in the pursuit of freer trade and more open markets? The importance of American leadership to the progress of freedom was emphasized by Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore. He made a statement before a joint session of Congress last fall. And let me just conclude by quoting from this speech. He said, "If, because of domestic problems, the United States loses the will to maintain open and fair trade, protectionism and retaliation will shrink trade and so reduce jobs. Is America willing to write off the peaceful and constructive developments of the last 40 years that she has made possible? A replay of the Depression of the 1930s, which led to World War II, would be ruinous for all. All major powers in the West share the responsibility for not repeating this mistake. But America has the primary responsibility, for she is the anchor economy of the free market economies of the world. In your hands, therefore, lies the future of the world. Our friends are calling on us to lead, to remain true to the economic and political values that form the bedrock of our way of life. We need the vision, statesmanship, and yes, courage that inspired the Founding Fathers 210 years ago. If we are true to our principles, we can lead the world to a future of progress and prosperity. I thank you. Now, I know
don't have any questions for the rest of the period.
I know no one has any questions after that. I think I saw a hand over here first, please.
First, I have a question, but I can't resist taking exception with something you said earlier.
It's not an atypical event for me.
History shows that that free trade is something that has always been advocated by leading powers in the world, leading trade powers, leading prosperous countries. And I think that history shows that has been the rhetoric more than the reality, that free trade has in fact been practiced only when a leading power, such as the U.S. today, has been in the position to dominate world markets by producing at an advantage a superior rate of productivity and superior technology and so on compared to its trade partners. Indeed, the U.S. has been in that position after World War II. It seems to me that it's clear that something very serious has been happening, and evidenced by the deterioration of the trade balance of the U.S. And unless this is addressed directly, that's the issue of what it is that has made the U.S. lose this advantage as a trade partner to the other leading industrial countries. Advocating free trade on the assumption that fair and unfair will make everything fairer will not make us gain this advantage, and advocating free trade by balancing our budget and essentially cutting government spending as an injection in the economy could lead to a recession, could lead to a cutback in our imports as a result of a recession, but once again would not guarantee that our industry would find the climate for investing, modernizing, for making that steel industry, that shipbuilding industry, that auto industry, and even the computer and electronics industry catch up. And you have not addressed this question. The question is, how are you going to address especially that issue, the issue of making investment possible?
Well, there are a lot of things that were said in that question. I always like the questions to be longer than my answer. It's sometimes helpful. Well, look. First of all, let me go back and make a statement that I made in my remarks, and that is that the trade deficit isn't a function of trade policy. It doesn't significantly affect that. Okay, I'm not saying that there isn't a dramatic need to have fairness in the system, to open those markets abroad so that we have fair competition. It is, and it's something that we have to do, and oftentimes we have to use leverage to do that. What I'm suggesting in these comments is that the United States plays and has played a leading role in ensuring and pressing forward for a free and open, as open a world economy as possible. All right, and free trade, freer trade, more open markets is a part of that, and that the result of not doing that is not in our interest. All right. It's not in our interest because if you begin to restrict trade, either in terms of the U.S. market and then in terms of our foreign trading partners' markets, the flow of goods and services between countries shrinks. All right? And what happens as a result of that? The world economy shrinks. All right? It's a pie. And we each get, as a result of that, a smaller piece of that economic pie. Is that good for the United States? I don't think so. I know it isn't. Is it good for Baltimore? I don't think so. I know it isn't. And that's what this is all about. Yes, you have to get at those foreign unfair trade practices. And yes, you have to do something about the trade deficit. But do the right things. Don't do the wrong things. And that's what the debate is all about in Washington right now. Please, you had a question.
In retrospect, I'm thinking of the situation with Japan. They voluntarily came through with their own restrictions. Now, I didn't see it at the time, but you can certainly see it from after the fact. Why didn't we put a tariff at a certain point rather than letting them ship these units through under their voluntary, but all they did was load them down, and they made more money than if we had said, no, you're not going to come in with above an X amount.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering who was throwing the ball on our side.
Ha! Well, the first rule of thumb is you never name names in Washington unless you're desirous of a job in the private sector. Let me just say that there's no question that what the Japanese did under restriction, their own voluntary restrictions, if you will, was that it cut down the number of automobiles. The demand for those automobiles went up in the U.S. It's an economic fact of life. The result of that was the Japanese, being intelligent people, decided, well, what we're going to do is value added. We're going to move upscale, and that's what they did. And they made very large profits. Thank you. I didn't answer your question, but I agreed with.
We got Zills out of the deal.
Well, look, it raises a broader question, and that is that sometimes governments do intervene. All right. In this case, it was a voluntary restraint on the part of the Japanese, but we have steel quotas that we go out and negotiate with other countries, and we've done so. You have a debate that is ongoing, but that you have socioeconomic reasons why you take these measures, because of the dislocations, because of the hardships, etc. But what you try to do as a result of that is to create an environment where those industries will adjust to competition, right? Like our automobile industry, they come in and we say, you know, you've got this period of relief from the total number of Japanese imports. Well, you better take advantage of it, folks. You better get competitive, because it isn't going to last forever. Same thing with the steel industry. And that's what adjustment is all about. And there's legitimacy to the adjustment argument. That's a reasonable governmental approach. But it's done very carefully and selectively, and not always reflecting the desires of many cities and many states. Let's see. I think you did have your hand up.
Could you give us an example of what you consider an unfair trade, not policy, but trade practice, and what would you do about it if you found it? You said you would correct it. How would you?
Oh, there are lots of them. A lot of them out there. Let's take one of my favorites.
What was the question?
Excuse me?
What was the question?
The question was that I had mentioned a number of times in my remarks about unfair trade practices. The question was, give us an example of what an unfair trade practice is, and what would you do about it? I think that was fairly accurate. Let's take an example of subsidies. All right, let's take an example of the European community and agriculture. What the European community does in agriculture is it provides export subsidies for its agricultural production. Export subsidies which then go out into the world market and compete with our exports with having the benefit of a subsidy which allows them to be more competitive in that market than our own producers. That's unfair. It has another side effect which is very, very bad. It pushes the world price down so that everybody ends up getting less as a result of that subsidy. What are we going to do about it? Well, one of the things that's really a priority in the new round of multilateral negotiations that we hope to launch this fall is agriculture and agricultural subsidies. And what we want to do is bring those practices that are now outside of the international system under discipline, so that there are rules that the Europeans have to abide by, just like we do. There's another way to go about it, and that is when we find that kind of practice in a specific instance, we have laws which our private sector has access to, which say this is an unfair practice, and if we prove and they prove that it is, then we go after that practice. We can do it in an international organization called the GATT, or we go after them, and if we can't reach agreement in negotiations, then yes, sometimes we have to fall back on retaliation, something which I was opposed to as a basis for our policy, but sometimes it's necessary for leverage. Okay, you're welcome. Please.
I happen to have attended the probably first or the second conference of GATT in Geneva in 1947.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
No, you referred to GATT, and I'm
Yes.
glad you did, because that's very important for the third world countries in particular, one of which I am, and continue to be concerned about their welfare, although I'm a US citizen now. What is this? My feeling is that there has been, from the third world point of view, a negative evolution of American policy under President Reagan towards GATT insofar as third world countries' interests are concerned. Is that correct, or will you elaborate on it?
Well, I don't know what specific example you might be able to offer about that, but let me answer it a little bit differently. The answer is no, in terms of disadvantaging developing countries in the GATT. The answer I would submit to you is no. But there is another question that is associated with that, and that is the GATT itself, this international organization, which is if we have a system, it is represented by the GATT in terms of trade internationally. And that is, along with the coalition of groups and associations and private business that I indicated in my remarks that I have seen deteriorate for free trade over the years, I have also seen in recent years a deterioration in the optimism that's the GATT is held. In other words, the GATT is seen by some in the United States as becoming increasingly irrelevant. All right? I don't happen to share that. I spent 2 years solid representing the United States government at the GATT. But it is a problem because people believe it is a problem. That's why this international negotiation in the GATT is so important, because it has to bring some credibility back to that organization. So the question is a good one. Please. No, right here. Oh, okay. Sorry.
One of the problems, I think, in our industrial policy is the fact that U.S. manufacturers are now doing operations abroad, and the manufacturing is producing goods which are consumed in the United States. Now, what do you think about a national industrial policy to sort of monitor what our American-based companies are doing in order to keep jobs in the United States, to manufacture in the United States, and also in another very important area, to see that United States companies respond properly to the needs of consumers, both in the United States and in foreign countries. I find that American companies are very poor responders to the actual needs of consumers, not only in this country, but in other countries, which allows for trade in overseas, and also allows for the growth of foreign manufactured products in the United States.
Okay. Yeah, good question. Even if I wasn't looking at you at the beginning of the question. Look, the answer in terms of industrial policy, and you phrased it in terms of monitoring. Monitoring in a governmental sense always means that the government gets its fingers into the pie. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea because it means more government. It means we're more intrusive in the business of the private sector. Government mucks things up, basically. Sometimes it can do good, but you need less government, not more government. In terms of the consumer question, well, the way I could, I guess, best answer that is consumers ought not to buy the product. It is a marketplace. Sure, you have to have some standards, and we have standards, and you have to require that these companies meet those standards in terms of safety, product safety, etc. But you don't want to overregulate. The marketplace takes care of that. If it's a good product, it's a quality product, people are going to buy it. If it's not, they're not going to buy it. And that's the simplistic answer, but that's all you're going to get. Please, I have there's a second, a follow-up question.
So he asked the question, what do we do about American companies that manufacture overseas?
Right.
Third world countries, and sell here.
Right.
Which takes jobs away from the Americans. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's basically.
Not you didn't answer.
Well, I thought I did. But, the point is that certainly there have been a number of corporations and companies that have gone offshore. And they've gone offshore for reasons that they believe in terms of that business and their profit and loss statement for very good reasons. What we want to try to do in a governmental sense is to provide the economic environment that will be conducive to a stronger economy, to more competition, to more efficiency in terms of corporations in this country. If you want me to say to you that we ought to somehow restrict the ability of our producers and our business community to go offshore, I won't.
Well, I think one question is, do we call it an American product or not?
Well, in terms of an American product, you get, and we've got so many gray areas. Sony has become considered in many areas of an American product. So that when they go overseas, you know, sure, they're considered, I suppose, by the American consumer, and it varies with individual cases, but they're considered to be an American product. And yes, when they come back in from third countries, they do count against our trade deficit. You're right. I have a note here. Helen Bentley, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I knew you and I would get into a debate because I'm one of those from Washington who totally disagree with you.
Well, it wouldn't be the first one in Washington that disagreed with you.
And I have always thought that the State Department needed an American desk there, and your statements tonight confirm that.
We do have an American desk, that's right. And one of the things, as you raise that, let me proselytize a little bit. And that is that when I came to the State Department about 11 months ago, the kind of thing that Representative Bentley mentions was there in spades. That the only thing that the State Department ever did was look out for the interests of the foreigners. All right? And I know that. But I think if you'll check with a number of our, and I'll be glad to give you a list, major corporations, as well as our associations in town in Washington, we're making a concerted effort to change that view. And if you see the change in terms of the policies over the last year or year and a half, those policies, which I happen to believe have been very successful, very helpful in terms of the international economic environment, have been a result of the State Department playing a very important role. Now, I don't want to get into defending the State Department. Hell, I've been at the Treasury Department, the White House, the Commerce Department, abroad, and only 11 months of the State Department. But I know what we're trying to do. But your question and your comment is a good one. There has been that problem. That doesn't mean that has to go on. I have neglected this end of the room.
A good part of the world has benefited from our technology and from Europe's and so forth, and we've done that principally to raise the standard of living in third world countries. Do you think it's reasonable that we make some ties to transferring that technology or capital to third world based upon their paying their workers to raise their standard of living?
Well, there are a lot of good questions there. I mean, there is no doubt that technology transfer is a very difficult issue. It's difficult not only in terms of the third world, but also between industrialized countries in terms of what is strategic, what do you have export controls on, do you limit our private sector's ability to compete, etc. What we need to do with respect to the developing countries to protect our own interests is to get after the lackness in those countries of intellectual property, copyright, patent protection, that kind of thing. And that's one of the key priorities for us, both bilaterally and multilaterally. But it's slow going. And why? Because they can take advantage of it. But it's a good question, and yeah, it's a major priority for us. Please.
You mentioned about the efforts to promote free trade between Canada and the United States. What possessed the administration to take the sanctions against Canada on shingles, which causes retaliation on our agricultural products?
Well, I certainly can't have a judgment on the case itself, or I mean, what went into people's minds in making that judgment. But there was an industry, and an industry that was undergoing difficult times. Under our law, if a part of our what's known as our International Trade Commission finds that there's injury, and the government looks at that case and sees whether it's valid or not valid, whether the industry will have an opportunity to adjust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, the President decided that it was appropriate to impose that level of protection.
He has called. He can make recommendations about it.
That's correct. He has discretion as to whether he accepts the recommendation of that particular body, makes another decision on the basis of a menu of possible options, or he can do nothing at all.
Would you like to comment on the Canadian reaction?
Strong. In the back of the room.
Protectionism becomes a more heated topic today than 10 years ago. It was a huge negative balance of payments that have taken place for the last few years. The question I'll ask them, has there been any great change in protectionism by other countries that accounts for this tremendous negative balance? Or is it our own improper fiscal and monetary policy that have led to the high value of the dollar and decreasing productivity growth?
Well,
perhaps we're dealing with the smoke and not with the fire.
Okay. Look, one of the things that's clear is that protectionism has certainly not abated around the world. It's increased substantially, and that's one of the concerns that we all have. In terms of the trade balance itself, again, it is not significantly affected by trade policy, by access to markets. Again, that is not that we shouldn't go after those markets and those unfair practices for our people. But that's not what is at the root of our trade deficit. And again, I go back to the questions of savings and investment, and essentially the current account, which is comprised mainly of trade, that deficit is equal to the excess of domestic investment over domestic savings. And that's where you get into the question of the federal budget deficit and the impact on our savings rate. And that's where you get into the question of domestic savings, consumer savings, business level of economic activity in the economy, etc. But those are the fundamentals. The savings and investment relationship is where the trade deficit lies underneath. Yes, as a result of that as well, you have seen a strong dollar. The strong dollar disadvantages our exports and means imports are cheaper. Okay? We've had disparities in growth rates between the U.S., which grew very, very rapidly, and our trading partners, which did not grow as rapidly. That accounts for it. Major markets in developing countries for us. Okay? Growth markets for us in the manufactured side. They began to dry up because of all of the problems with international indebtedness in developing countries. It's a whole spectrum of issues here. But the fundamentals are savings and investment, and they are not in terms of trade policy. Not that it isn't important. Please, sir. I've passed you over 2 or 3 times. I apologize.
Well, I have thought a lot about protectionism. And the title of your speech is Dangers of Protectionism.
Well, actually, I don't know. It's trade policy. Where will America lead?
Well,
I had to look at it too. So I don't know.
Well, my letter says Dangers of Protectionism, so I'm going to stick to my letter.
I'm in trouble.
Dangers why? Because of retaliation, obviously. Primarily, retaliation is the thing that America wants to avoid. And I think that's certainly valid. I'm wondering if there isn't some way to help American industry without resorting to public protection. You talk about the economic and what was the word? Economic and
political freedom.
And political freedom.
Right.
Might there not be some way to separate those two things and say that we can have political freedom, but we don't have to have economic freedom to the extent that we are afraid to protect ourselves from these vicious problems that come up. And I am sure that maybe there's a way that you can get around it. And that is that
I've only been at the State Department for 11 months.
That policy of protectionism would not be a policy adopted by the government, but that the public at large might develop some efforts to try to protect themselves from the lost jobs that are taking place in this country by creating some kind of a public crusade to buy American. It seems to me that...
I think someone has hit a responsive chord.
Well, crusades are always popular anyhow. But this could be an attempt to arouse the public to the point that if they're buying a shirt and they look at one made by an American company instead of the other, and it's probably just as good or a few cents different, if we could rouse the feeling of the public to the idea that they ought to keep American production in mind as one of the things that they'd like to foster, that this might in itself become a substitute for protectionism by the government?
Well, the Buy America provisions, there are Buy America provisions in state governments, and there are basically Buy America provisions in our procurement operations in the Defense Department and elsewhere. But let me, there are a number of things there, but let me just quickly address on the terms of retaliation and protecting ourselves. Look, there's no question that we need to be aggressive in seeking out and getting rid of, eliminating barriers to our exports that are disadvantaging our people and the competitiveness of our people. And sometimes, yes, you have to retaliate. But what I was saying in my remarks, and at least trying to say, is that you don't base your policy on mandatory retaliation. That's not the way to go. Well, people.
Maybe the public can do, the government can do something, could do nothing, and just let the people, this thing rise up among the people themselves.
Well, on the Buy America side, we've and historically, it doesn't matter what administration, we've opposed Buy American provisions.
Afraid.
Well, not afraid. You have a choice to buy American anyway. Now, you're a consumer. You can buy American. All our consumers can do that. It's the quality of the product. It's the price of the product. And I don't want to get into a debate on Buy American, but there are two sides to that story as well. Buy American has a great deal of appeal, but it also can mean that the economy as a whole, again, not to be this ruthless economist, doesn't think about people now, but the economy as a whole can be disadvantaged if we either protect our market from those goods that we need at the price we need. So there are different sides to that particular argument. There's a question.
You say that protectionism is not the answer to the problem. Are you implying that the fiscal and monetary measures that have been taken already will correct it? And if you really mean that, how long do you think it will take to eliminate the deficit?
Well, I mentioned to someone earlier this afternoon that I don't mind making predictions as long as they're not about the future. And there's no question that getting our federal budget deficit straightened out, balanced, all right, will have an enormous impact because it is voracious in the sense of our domestic savings, all right, and that again is a critical element in determining that trade deficit, the savings and investment relationship. So yeah, and that's why we have spent the last 2 years in great frustration and difficulty, and Representative Bentley knows full well the difficulty that this issue and the frustrations that have been in Washington and around this land in trying to do something to deal with it. So.
Would you say that, I'd like to get back to the basic congressional bill itself. Typically this comes about as a quick fix to a tremendous problem. I wonder whether you perhaps could comment on some of the fallacies in the bill and perhaps some of the possibilities of strengthening the bill through amendment, etc.
Yeah, well, there are a number of provisions in the bill that we are opposed to. There are provisions which, again, fall under the heading of mandatory retaliation to varying degrees with varying outs depending on how the language is drafted. There is a provision that if in a specified time period, those countries that are currently in major surplus in trade with us don't reduce by, I think it was 10% a year, then we would retaliate, and it would be mandatory, more or less, that we would do that. That's a provision that, again, I think misunderstands the real problem and the cause of the problem. And it really pays little reality in terms of the nature of dealing with other sovereign governments. It is a question of fundamental economic policy, domestic economic policy. International economic policy is basically an extension of domestic economic policy. That's one. There are any number, and if you would like, right, I'd be glad to talk through with you a number of the provisions afterwards. But that's one example. There's International Fair Labor Standards provision. There's a loss of discretion for the president in how he applies the laws. There are a number of things there, but they all go in the same direction, which I believe is the wrong direction. A lot of them, not all of them. They've got some good things in there. I mean, the trade negotiating authority for the new round of trade negotiations, etc. But I think it's a political year. At least I heard something about it. Haven't had a question over here for some time.
Of course, it's impossible to get a consensus of economists.
Yeah, you lay them end to end in a room, and you still wouldn't have a straight line.
Walter Hart, Paul Samuelson, and all the rest. But how do they feel about this? Do they support you, or are you pioneering? How do they feel about HR 4800?
Well, I mean, again, that depends on I suppose who you talk to, but there's pretty general agreement in the economic world. There will be others, some pockets of economists who might not feel that way, but generally, I think it's fair to say that would be opposed to the bill as it is currently drafted. Yeah, in the back, you, sir.
You made several good points favoring more open trade and freedom protectionism, but I noticed you had not mentioned one argument I've seen quite often, which comes from the third world countries, and that is how are the Argentinas and Brazils of the world to pay back their debts, which are mostly U.S. banks, if they cannot sell their goods and products in the U.S. And I wonder if you omitted mentioning that because you don't buy it, or...
No, the only thing I mentioned in terms of the opposite side of the coin, basically what I said was that our trade deficit also is impacted by the fact that we haven't been able to sell in those markets because of the indebtedness problem. Yeah, there's no question that especially in the last couple of years, that we've taken in an enormous level of imports from developing countries, and that has contributed to a certain stability and an ability to pay those debts. But what the developing countries need to do is to get their own houses in order domestically, economically, in terms of adjustment. They need to do those things which we were talking about tonight in terms of private incentives, less government intervention, that will make what is the only solution realizable, and that is growth. We're not going to get out of this debt problem with developing countries unless we find a way to ensure that they can grow. Right here, please.
You talk about making our products competitive, yet there seems to be a growing number of corporate mergers taking place just for quick financial profits rather than any thought of improving productivity. Can you comment on that?
Not a good one to comment on that. just not, I say that honestly, not because I want to duck the question. It's just that that's not an area that I really have much contact with. It's more of a domestic economic finance question, and so I could probably answer it and act as if I was an expert, but I won't do that. You can act as an expert about those things you know the least about. No? No say. Please.
We in the United States take a look at the receipts of imports versus the receipts of exports to come up with a trade balance, and when imports exceed exports, we call that a deficit, and so automatically we think bad things because it has that word deficit attached to it. And yet economists tell us that this quote-unquote trade deficit isn't all that bad because it keeps inflation down, it benefits consumers, it allows us to enjoy products which we might not otherwise have. And so my question is, as we shift to a service economy in the United States and don't need the manufacturing economy so much, what's wrong with the quote-unquote trade deficit? Why can't we allow more?
Well, I wouldn't agree with you that we're shifting to going to be a service sector, but in terms of what's wrong with the trade deficit, is that it reflects underlying fundamental problems. A trade deficit is, and the ones that we've run at historic levels, is an indication clearly that something is out of balance. All right? And in this case, again, I can come back to it, the savings and investment relationship. And that is a fundamental problem for us.
Well, if we're able to export our dollars overseas and if the foreign investors are willing to hold our dollars, what's the problem?
Well, what I thought you were going to ask, and maybe you are, is what's wrong with financing the difference between domestic investment and domestic savings by the inflow of capital from abroad? Right. Well, it creates enormous strains in the system, and it provides for instability in markets. And that's what we've perceived and seen over the course of the last couple of years. So fundamentally, just as a large trade surplus is not a good thing, nor is a large trade deficit. Here.
You have fallen into a trap with the Japanese and the Europeans and perhaps the Canadians, and they will keep you in dialogue for quite some time until the next administration comes in. And they're expert at this. And we can go about attacking this problem piece by piece, as you suggest, industry by industry or company by company. But the companies are running out of money to address this issue, and the legal friends that I have are profiting from the exchanges that we have going on. And the Canadians, for example, that you mentioned with free trade, there's an example that occurred just this year where a good company in the United States was low bidder on a contract for $700 million. But the Canadian government intervened and gave New York City subway system a lower interest rate, which in turn let this Canadian outfit come in at a lower price or a lower cost for the New York government. And these are the kinds of issues that are real gut issues that are going on day after day after day, while the Japanese or the Europeans are saying to you, let's open our doors. Let's go to it, guy. Let's be free. And then you'll have this dialogue. You've been at the State Department for 11 months, and you'll be there for another period of time if you don't mention names and don't do this. I suggest you'll stay there quite a while. In the meantime, our industrial base is being eroded.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yeah, no, it's a good comment, and it shows the nature of real problems out there for people and for businesses. And there are unfair practices out there. And remember what I said about purity and virtue. There isn't. It's a tough game. It's dollars and cents to people. And yes, I have a lot of those people that come through. And yes, it is frustrating to deal with the Japanese in negotiations or the Europeans. You know, I have when I have businessmen come in and talk to me about problems Japanese and are very frustrated and what have you, what I tell them at the end of the session is, if you look around the United States government and you find someone that's highly agitated, frustrated, maybe a little alcoholic complected, you can be damn sure that they're working in U.S.-Japanese relations. And that doesn't answer your question. But piecemeal, yes, we have to go at them bilaterally. But what we also have to do is go after them in terms of increased discipline, rules of the game, so that they can't continue to take the kinds of measures against our people that we find over time. And
how about some upset Japs in their government over the trade balance in America? That's where we have to worry.
Well, the Japanese are very concerned right now because of the appreciation of the yen. There's no question about that. And they have undergone their own domestic, difficult political situation. I see someone on my left about to take the mic. Let me just close, all right? I know there are lots of questions, and maybe afterwards that we can, if you come up, I'll try to address them. But let me try to leave you with a story that President Reagan likes to tell, and it was even mentioned briefly in this week's Time magazine. They didn't tell it right. But it's something that I think is indicative, at least, of the attitude that I hope we all have. And that is, it's a story about two boys. One's an avowed optimist and the other is an avowed pessimist. And there's a behavioral scientist. And that behavioral scientist wants to try to change that behavior of those two boys and see if he can do it. So he takes two rooms. And in one room, he puts all the finest toys, electronic gadgetry, etc. And he puts the boy that's an avowed pessimist into that room. He waits an hour, and he comes back. And here's this little boy in the middle of this circle of finery. And he's there, and he's crying and sobbing and just sitting in the middle of that room. And the behavioral scientist says, "What in the world can be wrong with you?" And the little boy looks up, and he has a tear in his eye, and he says, "I'm afraid I'll break these." And he takes the other little boy, who's the avowed optimist, into another room that he has previously dumped floor to ceiling a pile of manure. He puts this little boy that's an avowed optimist in that room, comes back an hour later, and here's this little boy on the top of this pile, just throwing stuff over his shoulder. And the behavioral scientist says to him, he says, what is it that you're doing? And the little boy looks up and he's got this smudge on his eye and he says, "There's got to be a pony in here somewhere." And that's the attitude that made this country great. It's the 4th of July. Yes, we have problems. And yes, we have to do something about it. But we got to do the right things. And I really appreciate, and I mean that sincerely, the opportunity.
No one expected unanimity on any of the questions raised this evening, nor even full agreement with everything which our good guest was presenting. The fact that our guest would choose to share with us a set of convictions which he shares, which he holds very deeply, and policies to which and aspects of policy to which he's committed is something which I know we appreciate. Further, he does so at a particularly important time with respect to legislation in the United States, and we're delighted that you chose to do that. In short, we can thank our distinguished guest for sharing with this particular forum at this particular time part of an ongoing discussion which is deeply important to this community and to the nation. And for that and for his care in his presentation, we thank him very, very much.